We'll just wait a minute for folks to join in.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So let's get started. I'm very glad to welcome Kevin at this first workshop at ETHOdyssey. ETHOdyssey, for those of you who don't know, is part of the ETH India Online Hackathon series. It's been home to some great hacks and projects over the years. And, you know, this is where it all starts. So this is the kickoff is actually tomorrow, but then we thought it would be good to go ahead and get you all started with Truffle in particular, which is one of the cornerstones of any developer's framework in Ethereum. So with that, I won't keep you waiting. I'll hand it over to Kevin, who can, you know, take it forward.
Cool. Thank you, Denver. Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Denver and everyone?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me and being the first speaker to kick things off. Yeah, as mentioned, my name is Kevin Bluer, and I'll introduce myself a little more formally in a moment. I did see one question from Shreyas about any prerequisites for this webinar, and the easy answer is no, not really. Lots to cover and lots of hopefully fun stuff and useful stuff, but you don't. It's not going to be kind of interactive in the sense you need to be coding yourself or anything like that. So all good. Can I? Okay, I have to say that's done. But yeah, on that note about questions, either throw them in the chat or in the Q&A, and I'll kind of keep a periodic eye on both as we go through. Cool. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. Okay. Can you guys see that, Denver? Looking good? I'll go ahead and full screen it.
I can see that you've started. Yeah, I can see your screen now.
You can see my screen? Perfect. Yeah. All right, so let's jump in. Yeah, so welcome to this session, the title of which is Getting Started with the Truffle Suite. Prerequisites, as mentioned, not really anything, at least in terms of prior experience per se. This and or needing things on set up on your machine. It's really just something to watch and perhaps take notes and and so on. Briefly about myself, just for some context. Yeah, my name is Kevin Bluer. My official title is a little bit amorphous. Is that of blockchain engineer, ecosystem person, and technically I'm with Truffle, as of course Denver mentioned. We're also now part of Consensus as well, which is why I kind of caveated that point. And again, if you're not familiar with either, don't worry, we'll kind of unpack both of them as we go through the session. And then yeah, just kind of a little bit of brief couple of bullets on myself. 15 years plus in software development, kind of at the point where I round it down a bit now because it's probably a bit more than that. But what it has kind of given me is the opportunity to see a number of different work across and develop across a number of different paradigms. Just more traditional, I guess you could say, like web stacks and mobile application development, but kind of enterprise software over the years as well. And then now for the last X years, 3-4 years, really deep in building in the decentralized kind of world, decentralized apps and so on. And I just put here, as you perhaps expect, pretty obsessed with the decentralized DX or developer experience. And by that, I mean all the tooling and process and workflow and so on that you go through to build decentralized applications. Cool. I did see some, I'll probably keep interrupting myself, but I do want to keep an eye on questions and stuff as we go through. Oops, let me see if that. I think there were one question from Sri Karan. Srikaran, sorry, will be the recording will be available yet later. Then there's another about logistics on the hackathon. And then I did see a question come through as well, although I can't open that up. I'll come back to that. Cool. So yeah, what to expect in this session. As per the title, we'll be doing a kind of dive into some of the tools within the Truffle suite, specifically Truffle itself. It's a little confusing because it's a suite of tools called the Truffle suite. And one of those tools in the suite is something called Truffle, but there's also others, one of which is Ganache, and there's more. And we'll kind of do a pass through some of those. Also, just talk about a few broader ecosystem tools that will be super useful from a hackathon perspective. And the other, the kind of other overriding theme with this session as well is trying to try to be pretty pragmatic with it in the context of a hackathon. Obviously, it's I've designed this session or this deck to be informative as well. But as I was saying to Denver just before we started, I'm a big fan of hackathons and have participated in a few recently in the last couple of months. So I've kind of infused some of that sort of understanding into this as well. So I've tried to kind of not keep it heavily academic, but a little bit more pragmatic to kind of really get you up to speed as quickly as you can on things in the context of the fact you're going to be hacking pretty imminently, which is awesome. So yeah, with that, I've added a bit on how to kind of extend and kind of build on top of Truffle, some of the kind of ways and hooks in which you can do that. And then the kind of second half almost is going to be coming out of the slide, out of the deck, and diving into a bit more hands-on things and just showing some kind of interesting and kind of new stuff. And you can see on my screen there. So a good example of a Truffle plugin, this visual debugger that I'll walk you through, and it's kind of useful, I think, in this context. A Truffle-themed NFT creator, which actually was an offshoot of a hack that I did for a hackathon, and kind of forked it and truffleized it. And then you can see the Filecoin flavored Ganache and some of the newer stuff in Truffle, which is our support for layer 2 as well, which is obviously a big theme and thing in the ecosystem and invariably within the hackathon as well. And then we'll close out with some good kind of pointers where to go next, and then Q&A. And as mentioned, I'll kind of try and keep an eye on things throughout the session. Cool. We just keep it. No more chat, I don't think. Alrighty, cool. All right, so like kind of starting super high level, and with a kind of 10,000 feet view of the Truffle suite itself. And specifically, as mentioned, we'll look at some of the tools. What I'll also try and do for those that are brand new to the space or relatively new, is just kind of infuse some of the Ethereum or EVM based, just kind of first principles and underpinnings as we go through this. I'm not sure of the kind of breakdown of folks in terms of your experience with the space. I'm guessing it's a mix, obviously, perhaps some that are relatively new to the space and have been, intrigued by all the kind of recent buzz and so on. And then I'm sure there's folks that are a bit more experienced. So as mentioned, I'll try and kind of cater to both, but I will try and infuse some of the kind of basics as well as we go through this, and definitely ask questions, and I'll try and get to as many, if not all of them, as we go through as well. Cool. So just broadly for context, what is Truffle suite? Really, it's a suite of tools, as you'd expect, and really designed to help you take an idea for a decentralized application and build that, create that, bring it to bear as comfortably as possible. So really we have a lot of the stages of the workflow and just different things that you'll need to do baked into the different tools. That you will, and that as per that life cycle and so on, then we have kind of different features within the tooling to kind of, let's say, kind of aid in that process and make it easier and as smooth as it can be. Everything we do is open source at github.com/Truffle suite. So that's our GitHub org. So if you look there, you'll see a ton of repos. We have all the kind of major ones pinned, but there's actually a long tail of other stuff and utilities and so on under that org as well. But yeah, the main ones, as you'll see, which are the ones pinned and what we'll go through now are Truffle, Ganache, and others. So, but a kind of 10,000 feet view, that is what Truffle is all about. And you've got a nice little graphic on the right-hand side here. Some of the icons representing some of the different tools that we have in the suite. And diving into those specifically, The first one is Truffle CLI, and that is a command line tool. If you're familiar with command line tools, making that assumption, of course, that really is about the development lifecycle of a smart contract or smart contract development lifecycle. And we'll kind of unpack those different stages in a moment. Probably jumped ahead a little bit. I've got like system requirements and installation and stuff here, a bit presumptuous. So don't worry too much about that right now, but it's kind of cross-platform, written in Node.js and easily installed either by npm or Yarn. But really, the takeaway is that it's a tool that has a ton of features within it that help you with that life cycle of creating contracts, smart contracts, and deploying them, testing them, maintaining them, and so on. Sorry for some background noise out there, guys. So in terms of, and again, kind of jumping into the detail here a little bit, of course, but some of those example commands that you'll start to fire off. And as I go through these, I'll kind of, as mentioned, inject some Ethereum kind of first principles and concepts and so on as well. But yeah, first one, command you can see up here is that of, and I'm really sorry for the background noise. Hopefully that's, let me know if it's too disturbing and I can see if I can get it stopped, but it should be brief. Just got someone doing some work outside. But I just saw a chat message. Perfect. Yeah, thanks guys. Cool. Yeah. So some example commands. So let's say you just installed Truffle and you want to build out an empty project. You can use something called Truffle init, Truffle, and you can see the command there, and that will literally create essentially an empty project. So all the necessary constructs that you'll need. So it creates a contracts directory, it creates a test directory, a migrations directory, and then something called Truffle config file, truffle-config.json. .js, sorry. And that's kind of essentially a boilerplate to get you started. Off the back of that, you can then run these create commands. We don't often use them, but you can then like Truffle create contracts, Truffle create test, and it will spin up bits and pieces, all in kind of very kind of vanilla boilerplatey fashion. But it's kind of nice rapid way to spin something up. A better way to do that is, or say better, but perhaps a more rapid way, which would be useful in the context of a hackathon potentially, is using a Truffle Box. I'll talk more about those later specifically because we have a lot of them and some very relevant ones I think for the hackathon. But there's another command there called Truffle unbox, and then you put in the name of the box or the path to the GitHub repository, and you'll both pull down that box, essentially clone it. And then there's this kind of post-install hook as well, where you kind of install any dependencies, do some perhaps setup, and then really you're off and ready to go, depending on what the context of the box does. And we'll talk through a bunch of those later, because again, they're really both great ways to learn and great ways to kind of get started as well. Continuing with that workflow theme, and I'll perhaps come on to the next couple of slides where I unpack some of these a little bit more. You've got this compile command. What that would do is take your contracts and, as you'd expect, compile them to Ethereum bytecode. What it actually does behind the scenes is takes your contracts, be those written in Solidity, Viper, or the two languages we support, and creates these things called artifacts. These are JSON files with all the kind of necessary information about those contracts, essentially kind of ready to go ahead and deploy them and so on and start working with them. So within there is the bytecode, the ABI, which is this sort of kind of meta interface schema for interacting with your contracts, things like the AST, any networks that you've deployed the contracts to, be that a local network, Ganache, that we'll talk about in a moment, or test networks, or mainnet, mainnet, or layer 2s and so on. All of that's stored in these artifact files that get generated upon compilation. And the next few, test, debug, migrate, I'll kind of jump over just because I've got a couple more slides on them as well. I'm going to unpack those a little more fully. So this was a init here. Again, I don't need to mention it anymore. The reason I'm not doing this live is just because this session, I think we've got about 45 minutes for it. So I was kind of I've got some live stuff in the second half, but for this, I thought I'd just throw in a simulated terminal on my screen just there, so that you can see a init, and then he just creates essentially this boilerplate project that we mentioned, compile the same thing. So I've done up there is Truffle create contract hello or hello world. That will create this essentially empty, not fully empty, but kind of empty-ish Solidity file, and then you go ahead and compile it. And then you can see somewhere in this output where it's created this build contracts directory, and in there is these artifacts that get generated. As mentioned, you can see I did just an ls there. Migrate. I don't think I'd mentioned migrate too much just yet. What that is taking the artifacts that you've created, essentially, the bytecode, the compiled contracts, which is what goes on chain. So you don't put the higher level language code on chain, be that Solidity or something else. You put this Ethereum bytecode, the EVM, which is the virtual machine, needs to function. That's what goes on chain. And then the way to get that on chain is through this migrate command. There are other ways. There's other ways to do lots of these things, by the way. This is just the kind of one of the truffle ways, as it were. We have this migrate command wherein you can both specify a network, be that one running locally or elsewhere. And of course, there's associated config needed with it. And then what will happen behind the scenes is it runs these migration scripts, these kind of imperative scripts that will essentially deploy the contracts to a given target network for you. And at that point, your contracts are on that network, be that again locally, if you're still kind of working on it, testing it, and so on, or test nets or mainnets or L2s or whatever. At that point, you can then start interacting with that contract as well, and building your kind of UI or whatever, means of interaction with it, etc. So an important command, of course. A couple more is debug. We'll see an example later, as I alluded to, of a visual debugger, which is a nice plugin that we have now to allow you to kind of visually step through, or at least more visual than the CLI debugger, which is what is kind of being referenced on screen here. But either way, irrespective, debug, as you'd expect, is a means of debugging your contracts, essentially walking through or stepping through your code. The way in which that works is it's assumed a transaction's taken place, or it requires that transaction's taken place. And in doing so, you're going to receive a transaction hash. So whatever you've done to you've interacted with your contract, you receive that hash, and then you can go ahead and debug it. And that's a nice way to test it out. Find issues and so on. And then the way in which you would do that, truffle debug, and then the hash, and then that will spin up this, at least if you're doing it this way, this interactive, CLI based debugger. And you can, I've kind of truncated these commands here, but you can just kind of, it's a bit cumbersome in a way at first because you need to build a little bit of muscle memory around the keys that correspond to the different commands, step over into, etc. But once you build that up, it's not too bad. But the visual one, which we'll see later, an example of later, is makes it a lot more easy, I would say. And there are some like Visual Studio Code debugger plugins. I don't know how well maintained it is, or at least the one that I used to use. But so there's again alternatives to this. Another kind of, I don't want to this is a little bit more intermediate, I would say, command like flag that we have on the debugger is something called fetch external. And again, same premise, you would still pass a transaction hash and a network. And then this fetch external flag, what that allows you to do is debug a transaction without having the source code for it. As long as that source code has been published on something like Ethers, well, the two that we support are Etherscan and Sourcify. So if someone's verified their source there, and again, more intermediate things that I'm saying here, this fetch external is really nice because you can then pull down that source locally, do some kind of orchestration and so on behind the scenes, and allow you to debug a transaction for which you don't have the source locally. So it's pretty neat, if you wanted to, especially if you're interacting with contracts that are already on chain, etc. So pretty neat. And we have a good kind of blog post for that. Bit hard to write that down, but if you like Google Truffle fetch external, you'll get it, which is kind of neat. So that's it, kind of. And again, I'm conscious that was pretty fast, kind of tore through Truffle. And what I'll do now, because I saw lots of chat messages coming through, is jump over, back over to that. So, sorry, just parsing through some of these. The deck will be available. Hard hat is better. Yeah. Hard hat is another tool for sure. Yeah. Not going to get into that now, but yeah, no, you know, we're pro all tools in the ecosystem for sure. Okay, hopefully everyone's good with volume and so on. Why am I wearing a hat at home? I've been outside and it's sunny. Yeah. Can you use VS Code instead of Truffle? You would use them together, to be honest. There is a Truffle integration for VS Code as well, that's maintained by Microsoft. But of course, if you're using VS Code and you've got the terminal opened up, you can, you know, use Truffle CLI within VS Code itself. So yeah, cool. All right. So again, brief tour of Truffle. The idea of that was just to give you a flavor of, you know, some of the commands you would use, and, you know, just kind of that very rudimentary workflow from, you know, initializing an empty project through to you know, doing the things you would do, compiling, you know, perhaps writing some tests, which I didn't talk about, but then you know, migrating to a network, be that local or otherwise, you know, debugging something potentially. So yeah, that's just a kind of tour of that, and I'll be coming back to this as we go through, for sure. Cool. So with that, we'll look at another tool in the suite, something called Ganache, and Ganache, in a nutshell, is a simulated EVM-based or Ethereum-based network that you can run locally on your machine. It can be completely offline. It doesn't need, you know, to be talking, you know, outside of your machine, and really designed to just make it as kind of rapid as possible and as simple as possible, just to get a network up and running locally. You could, you know, install any, you know, client software, be that Geth or Parity or others, and configure it such to essentially kind of behave in a similar manner, but it would be, you know, more kind of additional config that you'd probably be wrestling with, or perhaps doing it in, you know, a container of some kind. Again, none of this is like right or wrong. It's not saying you should never do that, but it's just, you know, Ganache by design is designed for development and just to kind of aid in that workflow, and, you know, whatever tooling you're using to kind of complement that as well. Same system requirements as Truffle. Key thing to note, and again, this is more of a thing for beginners as well, is that we have a few what we call flavors of Ganache. And I've got a screenshot on the next one, and we'll look at an example of the GUI-based version later, with a twist. But there's essentially kind of 2/3 flavors of Ganache, or two main ones, I should say. One is a CLI version. So, you know, just spin up and, you know, just start on the CLI, and you can interact with it and so on. It spits out a lot of output. But if you're really new to this space and you're wanting to kind of familiarize yourself with, you know, or perhaps even you don't know what you don't know yet, then Ganache Ui is a really good place to start, because it's, you know, UI, GUI based, and you get to see all the kind of core constructs of what's going on, and things you kind of need to start, you know, familiarizing yourself with, you know, visually, which is pretty useful. You know, things like, you know, addresses, and the associated Ether balances of those addresses, the corresponding private key for a given, you know, address. So you can click on that key icon, the number of transactions that have been sent from that address, etc. And that's just under the, you know, accounts tab. And it's obviously just a screenshot, but if you were to kind of then go through blocks, you know, as they're mined, the default is something called insta-mined, you know, meaning that as soon as the transaction is sent to the, you know, Ganache, you know, the network, it's immediately mined and added to a block. Obviously, in a, you know, in a live network, you know, testnet or otherwise, that's not the case. And you can configure, you know, Ganache to more simulate real world if you wanted as well. You know, so you've got perhaps latency and so on, and how your Dapp would handle that. Either way, it's a little bit of a tangent, but point being, you can see with all these tabs here that, you know, again, if you're really new, you know, I'd probably recommend installing Ganache Ui and just kind of orientating yourself around it and just looking at some of the tabs and playing around and so on. Just a kind of good way to fast track some of your understanding. Cool. I'm just going to jump into the. For some reason, the Q&A tab isn't opening up. It might be behind something. I'll try. Maybe I might have to come out of full screen in a bit to look at the actual questions, but I'll definitely get to them. Cool. So that's two tools, and again, I've kept them kind of brief. So that's Truffle CLI, Truffle CLI as a tool, and Ganache, and then going to do the different flavors of Ganache. And then with that, I added a couple of additional tools in for your workflow. This is by no means a complete list, and ones that I kind of use day to day, and you're invariably going to use, if you're working, not invariably, because caveat, there's always alternatives to things, but these are two equally kind of useful tools that serve different purposes. The first one being Metamask, and I didn't include the links on here, and that's a browser-based wallet. And again, apologies for those that are more experienced and perhaps have used Metamask for a long time, but for those that aren't and those that are new, perhaps don't have a wallet yet, Metamask is a great way to get started there. So it's actually a Chrome plugin, or Brave, or I think Safari, maybe not Safari, Firefox as well is supported. And then what that would do, is generates off the back of your mnemonic, which is a kind of passphrase type thing. It generates n number of accounts for you, and you can then, so that's your wallet in and of itself, and those obviously accounts can hold currency, ether, or tokens, etc. But perhaps more importantly is that you can use MetaMask to actually sign transactions that are invoked from within a given web page, and that kind of starts to get us into the Web3 realm, where you're actually got a web UI to your decentralized app behind the scenes. Because pre-MetaMask, I would say, and I've been using, I've been in the space a while. I remember, using Mist. If anyone has been in the space for a while and had experience with Mist, it was, an equivalent way to do what MetaMask does. But what it required was kind of ridiculous, because it ran a full node on your machine. And back then, I think it was still pretty big, 40 gig, 50 gig for me. But when I was learning, getting familiar with this space, I was like, what is it doing? Why does it take up so much disk? Now that would be impossible, well, largely because of the size of the mainnet chain. But what MetaMask does is it leans into, well, it actually uses Infura, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the point being, it's both a wallet and a means of interacting with decentralized applications. So you can sign transactions, sign and send from within within a given web app or Dapp, and then behind the scenes it will send that to the network and so on, give you feedback, etc., etc. So a really great way to get started if you don't have a wallet yet. And, just fire it up, go through the steps to get it set up, and start playing with some dApps, perhaps on testnets and stuff. I already referenced it, but another tool serving a very different purpose is something called Infura as well. And Infura is a gateway. Essentially, you can think of it as really just a node that you can rely on. Behind the scenes, it's a lot more than that. Some pretty sophisticated infrastructure, but you can point your web front ends to Infura and lean into it as a, leverage it as a node that your transactions get sent to. You don't have to. You could be running your own, or you could run, use alternatives as well, of course. But it's, probably the most popular infrastructure with which to do that. It supports, Ethereum mainnet, lots of test nets. Recently, and I'll reference this later, it supports some of the newer L2s as well. It's also an IPFS gateway as well. And one of the examples I'll show later uses Infura's IPFS gateway, which is kind of neat too. Talking, kind of going deep on IPFS and things like Filecoin's a little bit beyond the scope of this session. But again, Infura has support, has a kind of back for that too, which is pretty neat. Cool. So that's some additional tools. Big caveat, just scratching the surface of the broader tooling ecosystem in the space. Again, saying that if you are kind of at the newer end of the spectrum. Oh gosh, I see my screen is. Hopefully, it looks like my video is frozen up for me here. Can you guys still hear me? I'm just seeing myself frozen up. Yeah, Denver, can you hear me? You can still hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. But
okay, perfect.
Videos
I wasn't. yeah, I don't know why. I mean, I guess not that it matters too much. Let me just stop my video.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird. Zoom is generally pretty.
Yeah,
okay.
No, it's fine.
Is that better? Yeah, cool. All right. I think the main thing is hopefully you can still hear me and see my screen. So cool. All right, and now you can see me again. Awesome. So that's a couple of additional tools. Just to, again, with the caveat if you're new. All right, kind of moving on, and this is kind of back into Truffle tool land or Truffle suite tool land, and this is something called boxes. I alluded to them earlier on, and again, in the context of a hackathon, these are potentially pretty useful. What boxes are essentially kind of boilerplate projects that help you kind of get started, and or to help you learn and kind of probe around and so on. And we have a lot of them. I don't know the exact count, but there's tons. And depending on the context of the box, there'll be sample contracts, there'll be sample front ends written in different frameworks like React or Angular or Vue and so on. But there'll be more complete dApps as well. There's some good kind of end-to-end like NFT-based dApps, some good DeFi dApps, etc. So worth having I just realized I don't have the link here on the screen to it, but it's Truffle Suite. I think I have it towards the end. trufflesuite.com/boxes, and you can filter them from there. We have 3 flavors of boxes. Makes it sound kind of fancy, but 3 types, I guess. First one being official, which is a handful of boxes that we as Truffle maintain. So if there's breaking changes within our tools, we'll update the boxes accordingly, so they should be reliable, hopefully. We have partner boxes, so other companies that we perhaps work a little more closely with. If they put a box out there to help showcase, or help fast track devs for getting up to speed on their service or protocol or whatever, then we have a good number of kind of in quotes partner boxes. And then we have this long tail of community boxes, which are just written by folks out there in the ecosystem. We have a sort of submission process, and we just do a quick validation to make sure it looks reasonable and there's no kind of installation issues and so on. And if it looks good, then we'll get it added. So just kind of referencing the different types of boxes that we have. As mentioned earlier, the way to install a box, you could theoretically git clone them as well. They all reside as Git repositories behind the scenes. The upside of doing it via Truffle Unbox is it then executes this any kind of installation dependent, any dependencies. Not that you couldn't do that either. Yeah, so Unbox is a bit like sugar, just to make that experience of getting them downloaded and set up that bit easier, and just nicer kind of naming convention as well for ones that are supported or officially supported. Cool. So some recent boxes, just to kind of put a few out there that might be relevant again for the hackathon potentially, and we'll be briefly looking in a little more depth at some of the layer 2 ones later as well. But these are some of the ones that we've had got published a little more recently in the last like 3 to 6 months. And as you can see, if you're recognizing some of these logos, we have a Polygon box, a Optimism box in the context of L2s, of course, Scale as well. Aave, kind of nice box for just kind of walking through, getting set up with their protocol, with their service. A Filecoin box, which is pretty neat. Chainlink, etc. And I put this little icon, oops, stupid truffle icon in the bottom right, just because that's one that I threw up there quite recently that we'll be looking at later. You could use that, just potentially, some bits for your hack as well. And then Magic, formerly Fortmatic, now Magic, which is a kind of wallet service as well. So that's just a kind of few to kind of whet your appetite. But more specifically, if you are considering a hack, on any of these things, leveraging, leaning into any of these services, and boxes are at least a good place to have a quick browse and just see what's going on there, and perhaps help, as mentioned earlier, kind of fast track your understanding of their service. And generally, we have pretty good READMEs, essentially lightweight docs around them as well. So yeah, definitely a good kind of hackathon tip, hopefully. Cool. A few pointers on kind of what's new on and kind of upcoming with Truffle kind of suite. And we have a lot, we're kind of really, starting to kind of ramp up in size and shift, I would say shifting our focus, but kind of refocusing ourselves a little bit, going through kind of round of that. So a few kind of things I can disclose in terms of what we're doing as Truffle. So firstly, this something called Truffle DB. Again, this slide's a bit bare bones, but hopefully it's good enough. So Truffle DB is essentially, amongst other things, a replacement for the artifact format that I was referencing earlier. So when you do a compile within Truffle, it generates these pretty heavyweight JSON files that contain a lot, and they're great in the sense they're like thorough, but they aren't perhaps as efficient in terms of subsequent reuse. So Truffle DB is a kind of system with which to replace that. So the way in which you'd interface with it is through GraphQL. So you can kind of laser prize out just what you need, be that a subset of the ABI, the deployment history that you've gone through, etc. So it's live, I should stress. We have something called DB Kit as well, which is a pretty nice way of kind of playing around with it. We'll be doing more around it, as well. Hence why I kind of put what's new and upcoming. So, but just to put that on your radar. Another one, and we've already some work's been done on this already, which I'll allude to later, is on layer 2s. So a big focus for us. Obviously it's a big deal for the ecosystem, for the industry, I guess, and we're leaning heavily into that as well. And there's already some stuff that I can show you. With Ganache, again, changes there. We have a Filecoin flavored version of Ganache as well. I'll quickly walk through that in a moment. We also have a complete rewrite of Ganache underway. That's again going live pretty imminently. Calling it version, it's technically not correctly. Major version isn't 7. I think it's 2 or 3. I get confused, but I actually still don't even know the in-joke on why it's 7, but it's going to be 7. Something I've missed internally. But yeah, there's a complete rewrite. It's going to be, it's reasonably fast now, but it's going to be a lot faster. And the kind of benchmarking that's already been done internally around it is significant, which is awesome. Drizzle as well, which is this front-end library. I didn't really mention it earlier for a reason, but you could use it. People still use it. What it is a library of React components. Well, that's at least the high-level components that you reuse, but it's a means of maintaining kind of state within the front end for your decentralized app. But to be honest, we haven't maintained it much at all over the years, so it really needs that. So we're going to be putting a lot of effort into that as well. So having a kind of robust story on that, or at least better offering than it is right now. And that's kind of just scratching the surface, but lots more kind of on our roadmap as well. But that's just a few kind of things. Cool. Briefly, I just wanted to talk before I kind of shift to hands-on stuff, was just ways to kind of extend, in quotes, Truffle. Some of them a couple of these are a bit contrived, but I'll throw them out there anyway. Really, these are just, if you are using Truffle, as part of your your hack, these are just good commands to know. And I didn't mention these 2 yet. First one is this concept of just like executable scripts. So in the context of Truffle, we have this exec command, and basically that's just a script runner, and pretty nice for running scripts, automating kind of more mundane tasks. You can get at the internals of you can get more easily access the artifact files that we talked about earlier, and whatever you might be doing, you might if you want to kind of bundle it up into a script and make it more easily invoked, and perhaps by folks on your team, something you can consider. A little more robustly is something called a Truffle Plug-In or run command type thing, where you can then do Truffle. Once you've got it installed, you can then do Truffle run and then the name of the plugin. These are way more heavyweight in the sense they're a node module, so they can be installed accordingly via npm or yarn, and they more designed for reuse across multiple projects, and just more comprehensive and kind of robust in the way they work. So again, that could be something you might want to use, or even create a Truffle plugin for that potentially. We have variations on the above. So if anyone's been around in the space, you've probably heard of OpenZeppelin. They have this upgrade framework that kind of is a plugin, but it's not quite a Truffle plugin. But it's variation. If you wanted to add upgradability to your contracts, OpenZeppelin have a good kind of pattern for doing that, and that manifests as both some contracts and some scripts and so on. So that's kind of another way to extend it. If you were building focusing on dev tooling as part of your hack, then you might want to sort of look at what OpenZeppelin have done with that. It's pretty cool. And then finally, and this one is contrived, it's a way of extending Truffle, not really, just as boxes. You could create a Truffle box, if you want to share certain things, with the community. And then I did do something for a presentation I did towards the end of last year. It's called Bento, which was just examples of all of this in a box as well. If you did want to kind of rapidly see working examples of all of these things, including the OpenZeppelin upgrade, because some of these things can be a bit fiddly and to configure and whatnot. So just again, putting that out there. Cool. So with that, that's kind of all I wanted to cover really in terms of slideware. Before I shift to the hands-on piece, I will check questions again or chat. Slides, yeah, all good for sure. For anyone, and for some reason when I click on Q&A, it's not coming up. So if there's a burning question that I haven't answered that you want me to answer during this session, then throw it in the chat if that's okay. Otherwise, I'll probably come out of full screen and hopefully be able to get at the Q&A. Because like I said, I'm clicking on it now and it's just not showing up. So maybe that's another Zoom weirdness going on there.
Do you want me to help you with that? I can just run through.
Yeah, if there's anything that's timely. Otherwise, in the interest of time, I'll try and keep going.
Sure, I think.
But yeah, if there's anything that kind of is more of a clarification or anything like that, then feel free to shout it out.
Okay, someone's asking, does Truffle play a role in the backend of a Dapp?
Good question. Not per se. I mean, backend to me sometimes in the context of a Dapp is always a little bit fuzzy because your contracts, when you've deployed them somewhere, kind of serve, in my mind's eye at least, as if you think of it, in a kind of web tier style thing, like where you've got like a business logic server or web server, and then you've got a database. That would be typically kind of your backend. But contracts serve kind of both of those roles to some degree, because it's kind of got your logic for your contract, for your application or your Dapp, and the state, the data, kind of very lightweight database, of course, and expensive, but still a store of data. So the reason I kind of say that is because Truffle obviously doesn't kind of sort of persist, in the sense of, it's not kind of running as a service in your backend, in quotes, because that's by the nature of, a blockchain network, there's just nodes that are running that are, in receiving transactions, et cetera, et cetera. So Truffle doesn't kind of operate there when it's running. That said, it's like, it does allow you to kind of interact with things, even after they've gone live, as well. You could, from the development console, which I didn't show, you could, be pointing at mainnet and, do whatever you want to do. And I do that quite a lot, either it's mainnet or testnets, literally from my, Truffle CLI. So slightly long answer, so sorry about that, but I hope I kind of just tried to clarify it, I think. Yeah. So
I think a lot of these questions will be clearer after the hands-on.
Sure. Yeah. It sounds good. Yeah. Cool. And I did see someone said that they're happy to stay on a bit longer. I am too. I've got no kind of hard no more commitment directly after this, so I can stay on a little longer if needs be too. So cool. Yeah. Alrighty. So I'll close. Yeah. Feel free to keep throwing stuff. Try and lean it into the chat, and just in case I can't get access to the Q&A when I come out full screen. But so yeah, what I wanted to do now is just kind of, not just have this whole session like slide, is just actually show some stuff in action. And I'll kind of be referencing some of the things that we've seen or we talked about earlier as well. So in fact, with that, I will come out full screen maybe, and now I can see the Q&A straight away. Oh man, but I'll come back to that. Let me just close it for a moment, just in the interest of kind of make sure we kind of end roughly on time. Cool. So yeah, first thing I wanted to show is, in fact, I'll go back into full screen momentarily just to kind of frame this. Is a new thing that we've just put out there, more as kind of a preview / proof of concept in a sense, and this is Visual Debugger plugin. Now, this is a nice example of a plugin, as I mentioned here. I think it's pretty rich in the sense it does quite a lot. But as we'll see in a moment, it gives you a kind of visual layer to the equivalent of running Truffle debug, and to just it's kind of semi-configurable. But treat it, by all means, install it and try it out. But it's not been hardened or used in the wild too much yet. But the reason I want to show it, because it's kind of neat and it might be useful, if you want to debug stuff, as you're writing your contracts. But it's also a nice example of a plugin as well, if that's something you want to potentially consider for your hack, or as part of your hack, maybe not the whole thing. So the way in which you add it, and I'll show it in a moment, is just add it either via package manager, npm, or yarn. I haven't published it to npm yet, so it's still you'd have to reference the full, and add it via the repo, and then just add this to your Truffle config as well. And then off the back of that, you can just do Truffle run debug, which is the command name, and then one of the params subparameters is to start the debugger. And then what that allows you to do is it will output it to the console, this localhost 54321 on port 5321, and then that spins up this basically. If I just go back a bit, so what we're seeing now, all of this is running locally. So I've got Ganache running, and I've opened up, and I can jump over to my terminal quickly. Hopefully you can kind of see that. So I've opened up a development console here, and I've deployed an ERC 721. For anyone who doesn't know, that's like the closest thing we have to like standard for a non-fungible token, and have an ability to, they're badges in this context, so that the way in which you mint a new token or a new NFT is through this award badge method, and I'm minting it to the first account, and then this is the metadata, whatever, and I could change that. So Odyssey, I got that spelling right. Odyssey is always a difficult word for me to spell. So let me go ahead and so essentially I've just sent another transaction to Ganache there through something called this console, which is another Truffle command that I didn't allude to earlier on, but it just allows you to kind of interact with your contracts. Didn't see that, but it listens. So this plugin listens on your Ganache instance for blocks, and then I can jump into it, which is pretty neat, and now visually debug it, which is also pretty neat, I think. What's kind of nice about it, which I think is good from a learning standpoint as well, is it obviously you can step through the code as it's being executed, but it also pulls up just the corresponding tabs, or just the files, I should say, and tabs for those files, based on what the code that gets touched as part of the transaction's execution, essentially. So if you got keyboard shortcuts and so on, obviously got the usual suspect kind of bit controls that you'd expect and so on. Then you can have breakpoints and all that. But so I can then just start to step into, or in this case, step over a bit. But what's nice again from a learning standpoint is because it really rapidly allows you to, let me just step over a little bit. It's using a utility that opens up and provide called counters. To step over that guy, step over that guy, and then I'll step into the mint function. So this is now back into the internals of OpenZeppelin's implementation of the ERC 721 standard. And you can then just go ahead and kind of step through that. And then it's got a couple of checks to make sure that what's it doing, that is an address that it's being minted to, so a recipient of this NFT, and that the corresponding ID for the token doesn't already exist, because every token has to have a unique ID. So yeah, and as you can see, you can kind of jump around, and it's just a really nice way, I think, or we think, to just help you kind of learn as well as troubleshoot as well. Kind of what it doesn't support right now is fetch external. That's in the works, wherein you could literally, a really cool future state for this in my mind's eye has been able to just point at a given public network with a corresponding transaction hash, and then being able to have it do what the equivalent of fetch external, e.g. get the contracts that it needs, and allowing you to step through the full execution of a transaction for which you don't have the code for, etc. You just have a transaction hash that you might have, might be your transaction that you sent, and you've got the hash that you see on Etherscan, or Metamask and so on. And then you actually want to see what's happened with that. Maybe it failed for whatever reason. But multiple reasons that's useful, particularly not only just a learning standpoint. Cool. So yeah, that again, I'll go kind of quick through these hands-on things, but I just want to show this one first, particularly because it's a good example, let's say, of a plugin, but it's potentially useful if you are working on contracts and troubleshooting them and so on. This could be quick one to add to your project and then test it out. With finally, I'll say again the caveat that it's preview stage in a sense. But with all of this, I'll make sure I'm available throughout the hackathon as best I can be. If you have questions with any of this stuff, just reach out. Cool. That was the debugger, visual debugger. I always include screenshots just in case demos go off, go wrong, which sometimes happens. Cool. So that's, and again, I just want to present a little bits of everything with these hands-on pieces out here. Next one is this Truffle themed NFT creator and a few cool things, I think, or different things going on within this. This is available as a box, by the way. It's not listed in our /boxes yet either, so we haven't really kind of fully published it. But I'll show it. And again, could be some good kind of inspiration or utility for the hackathon. So this is it running. So I've unboxed it, spun it up, and what it allows you to do is kind of create these. Why can't I move that around? Oh, maybe I didn't get select. Weird. Let me just refresh it. Not really an issue. So I can then, there we go. Oh, I know why, that was the background. Yeah, so with this is, obviously it's kind of novel in the sense you can, create this, truffle, create your own truffle. It's kind of random, but yeah, you get the idea. What's cool, I think, about this, or interesting, is a few things beyond just that piece, but is that you can, the actual, and this to me is really kind of fascinating, this ability to save it directly to IPFS from within the context of a browser as well. So another command, as a momentary side note, is we have a command called Truffle Preserve. It's brand new, well, new, relatively new, that does some of that too. In this case, what I'm doing is if I hit save to IP, I didn't give it a name or description here, but whatever, you can see that it's actually sent two things to IPFS directly through Infura's IPFS gateway. It actually uses a library, an in-page library, a React component, I guess, called IPFS Mini. And then you can just configure Infura's, point at Infura's gateway or any gateway, your own gateway, or IPFS node. And you can then save whatever you want directly to it. And if I just open up this, sometimes a bit of kind of lag there, but let it just do its thing. And then this is the metadata for the NFT. This is NFT based again. It was the buzziest, craziest thing for a few months. It's kind of faded a bit, died down a bit, but still very cool. So these have now been essentially saved to IPFS. Sometimes it's like ridiculously fast. Sometimes there's a bit of latency there. And then I did there was two other things here. The ability to create a storage deal directly with Filecoin. That bit is assuming you've got Filecoin flavored Ganache running locally. It's not real storage deal yet, more of a simulated one, or just preserving it through a pinning service, Pinata, for example. Yeah, they're not opening up. Let me just try it again. It might be just my Brave IPFS gateway configurations a bit off. Doesn't matter. I mean, essentially what's happened is it saved both of those to IPFS through its gateway, got the hash for both the metadata and the image. Then off the back of that, you could go ahead and then mint these NFTs directly to a given network, to layer one. Obviously it's way more expensive, but it's kind of more immediately usable. If you want to use it in the context of an L1, perhaps immediately sell this NFT on a marketplace, for example, or if you wanted to explore, minting it to an L2 and bridge it back and so on. Again, beyond the scope of this session in a sense, but just this was some of the exploration with this box. I'm just intrigued as to whether these actually, I don't know why it's not working. It has to kind of do a transformation from like CID v1 format to CID v2. I'm just wondering if that bit isn't working for some reason. Anyway, but this is available as a box as well. I'm just gonna, let me just turn off my notifications again. I did just turn them off for an hour. Cool. So that's in the box. Again, in the interest of time, I'll move on. But yeah, that's kind of fun, and some good, example, good libraries or interesting libraries, at least you could explore, both the IPFS piece, the L2 piece, and so on within that. Cool. And then hands-on 3. And again, tore a variety of different things here. This is, again, relatively new, and something that we did in partnership with Protocol Labs, who are the creators of both IPFS and Filecoin. And this is something called Filecoin flavored Ganache. So we saw Ganache earlier in the context of an Ethereum node, spinning up an Ethereum node for you. Now we also now have the equivalent Filecoin flavored, equivalent Ganache, in the sense it's both a CLI and a GUI based version, but this time running a Lotus node. So if anyone has explored or played with Filecoin in any capacity, to run your own node, if you're going to be a storage miner, you would run, and maybe other implementations, but run Lotus. And I'm sure there's more you need to do, but I haven't done it. But what this does is, so there's a fair bit of config you need to go through if you can. It's similar, if you want to do the same thing for Ethereum, if you want to perhaps configure Geth or something to run locally, same thing. So this is really designed to just make, kind of Filecoin dev, if you're developing against Filecoin, really, really frictionless to kind of spin up that, Lotus node equivalent. We implemented like a sort of, not a full sub, a sort of complete subset of their RPC methods, because it's quite different to, an EVM based chain, but a logical subset. And then it also spins up an IPFS server. We have a good box for this as well, which kind of the really thorough README that kind of walks you through spinning all this stuff up. And what I did want to just show this as well. And again, this is, look, if you just at first glance, this would look very, very similar to the normal Ganache, I say Ethereum based, not normal Ethereum based Ganache, but you can see here everything's kind of different. So the accounts are, the addresses are Filecoin addresses, the balance is in Phil. And this, rather than blocks, you have tip sets and deals, and then the files that are essentially behind the scenes pinned by the miner, and so on. So visually very similar, but every kind of construct is tied to Filecoin. So again, if you're leaning into Filecoin and exploring that as part of your hack, then this will be a good way to kind of fast track your understanding of it and so on, because there's a lot of kind of moving parts, but I mean, it is awesome, and but different to Ethereum and as we know it. So that's that one, and I included some links. And then again, anyone wants the deck, we'll make sure it's available. And then finally, and we're just kind of coming up on time, so I'm going to go super fast. And I can go back to full screen, I think, for this one. Is just our new L2 support, both within Truffle itself. And there's, as I alluded to earlier, Infura has, some equivalent support for at least these two networks, these two L2s, and more in the works, I should say. But from a Truffle perspective, firstly, we've, it's kind of minor right now, but pretty powerful in the sense, if you are deploying stuff to different networks, maybe, certain, if you are like a bridging contract between mainnet and an L2, we now have support for multiple configs. So, you can compile, and in the case of, say, like, I'm not sure about Polygon, but with Optimism, there's a fork of Sol C. So the compilation is slightly different, just because, largely compatible, but there's some differences. So we kind of handle that a little bit behind the scenes through config and so on. More specifically, because we support multiple configs, and you can specify that. Same with migrations or deployments. You can have a different config for your L2, a different config for your perhaps mainnet. And all of this, I should stress, probably haven't done the explanation justice, is really thoroughly explained in the READMEs here, which gives you nice context for both of these L2s. And you can see here, we're doing a migration to Polygon in this case, and specifying the network as Polygon's mainnet. And in this case, that's going through Infura, so they have support for Polygon testnet and mainnet, or Mumbai and mainnet. Cool. So takeaway from that one is there's 2 boxes, and again, I'm going quick because we're just kind of coming up on time. Cool. So that was it in terms of those hands-on. Again, they were kind of very broad, trying to kind of program some different stuff, and hopefully that was useful. Next steps, if you want to kind of dive into any of this, I've just kind of aggregated a lot of those links there, included some ones that I didn't reference as well, which like things like DBKit and Ganache 7. And by all means, get in touch with me. I'll try and make myself, I'll work with Denver to make sure I'm kind of on hand as best I can be throughout the hackathon. But reach out to me, on email, kevin.doer@consensus.net. And another thing I just wanted to bolt on at the very last minute was not hackathon specific per se, but if you are wanting to, off the back of the hackathon, kind of go deeper, either with more kind of intro level training or a more deeper involved boot camp. We have this thing at Consensus. In this case, I'm taking off my Truffle hat, putting on my Consensus hat, maybe the same hat. This thing called Consensus Academy, if you've not heard of it, and a bunch of different courses, types of courses that we offer, and you can see, get lots of words on this screen. Maybe take a screenshot if that's interesting, or get the slides. But yeah, kind of covering 2 bases. Basic training is more intro to kind of give you foundational stuff to then take the boot camp, or if that foundational stuff's just interesting, in and of itself, you could of course take it for that. And then the bootcamp itself is really a deep dive into all this entire space, both the fundamentals and then, as it refers to in this like blurb here, like second order effects. So L2s, DeFi, all the kind of constructs that are emerging and starting to blossom in the space. So yeah, either check out those links or reach out to me or anyone on the Consensus side to kind of explore those out if they're interesting. Cool. So with that, apologies, we went over ever so slightly. But now we'll shift to Q&A, and I'll come out of full screen. So, and I'll cross-reference both the chat now, and I can now actually see the Q&A panel as well. So I'll kind of come back to that in a moment. Yeah, sorry, I kind of ran pretty fast towards the end there just to get through everything. But I'll backtrack now. So that was the question about the back end from Sammy, and then Prince. Oh yeah, sorry, let's make screen bigger. Sorry, yeah, I'm just on a MacBook Air at the moment, so I wouldn't have been able to make the screen bigger, unfortunately. So hopefully it was good enough. And then yes, recordings will be available later. I think Denver answered that. And then can you please explain the basic NFT storage and verification stack? Yeah, a moment. And the components around IPFS. I mean, again, a thorough explanation is probably beyond what I could say right now. But a high level for NFT storage, yeah, you of course want to be storing decentrally. Probably goes without saying. What we saw in sort of as NFTs were kind of exploding onto the scene was kind of crazy. A lot of the actual underlying assets, be that images or movies, like movies or audio or whatever, was stored centrally, which is just insane in my opinion, because it can be taken down, moved around, or whatever, get link rot and so on. So yeah, you want to be storing it decentrally, on IPFS. Now that said, as well, just storing it on IPFS doesn't mean it's going to be around forever, unless you're personally explicitly pinning it yourself. It's not, well, with a caveat, of course, either you're pinning it yourself through your own node, or using a pinning service like Pinata is pretty great, or of course you're using Filecoin and creating a storage deal with a miner, and that's the whole premise of Filecoin, to with which to do that, to store, create deals and have robust, decentralized storage, in the sense multiple people storing it, multiple miners storing it. So that would be, like first thing to go deeper on if you were kind of wanting to, if that gives you something at least. And then the verification side, I mean, I guess by extension, when you store something on IPFS, you get this concept of a CID, a content ID, which is a hash of the content. So in some senses, that's a verification of the authenticity of the original asset, because that can, if it got changed, well, even the way in which you reference it is off the back of the CID. So, you know, there's a degree of kind of authenticity / verification, I guess, there implicit in it. And perhaps I'll park it there in terms of the answer, but happy to take that offline. And again, I'm not a domain expert on that, but could connect you to other folks if you had, you know, deeper questions as well. But hopefully that gives you something kind of to go on with a sort of high level answer at least. Next question. And by the way, Denver, if we need to kind of wrap up in any capacity, then just let me know. If not, I'll just kind of keep riffing on these answers to these questions. So
take your time. Take your time.
Sure. Yeah, cool. Alrighty. So yeah, and then another question. So in simple terms, can I assume that I compile a contract in Truffle and deploy in Ganache for test? Yeah, pretty good, you know, description there. Again, apologies, you know, I kind of went pretty rapidly through it, but the slides are available. One thing I didn't really reference too much is we have pretty decent docs, particularly for you know, like that. You know, we have something called a quick start, which is kind of walks you through those steps, both in our own docs, you know, in our official documentation, and there's lots of guides out there, you know, Medium posts and that, you know, where people kind of will walk you through it, you know, as well. We also have some tutorials and so on. They're a bit patchy, you know, to be, you know, completely candid. You know, some are a bit more maintained and up to date. Others are a bit dated or aging, I would say. But yeah, lean into those and take a look. But yeah, conceptually, absolutely. You know, compile you write some code, you know, Solidity, or just take a box, you know, perhaps a Truffle box, compile it, and then go ahead and then deploy or migrate it to, you know, Ganache if you're just doing that locally. How many hours? So hopefully that helps. And again, reach out. I'll happily, you know, go through that a bit more thoroughly. And then how many hours per week for the bootcamp? I don't know. Quick answer to that one. But again, feel free to reach out and I'll connect you to Coogan, who on the consensus side, who oversees bootcamp or runs the bootcamps, and is awesome, and would be able to give you all the answers you need to the bootcamps. And then what are layers like L1 and L2 in the blockchain ecosystem? Gosh, great question. Big answer would probably be needed to do it justice, but high level at least. L1 refers to essentially the kind of base layer. So for all intents and purposes in the Ethereum world, that's what's referred to as mainnet. And when, you know, things were evolving, you go back a few years, you know, to do transactions on it were pretty cheap, relatively speaking, in terms of the amount of gas, you know, the cost of gas. But as it's kind of grown and exploded in popularity and usage, the cost of gas has gone up. The network sometimes gets kind of overloaded, and you know, and even so, transaction, you know, times or block times is, you know, relatively slow, and so on. So it's kind of fair to say it's kind of creaking a little bit at the seams. I mean, it works, it's awesome, you know, but it's not like, for various reasons, it doesn't solve everything, or there's deficiencies, I guess. So that led to this evolution of additional layers that kind of complement the L1, or in some cases run completely independently as well. And they are, you know, the characteristics or the challenges I just mentioned in most cases, you know, or in all cases, I guess, because that's what they're trying to solve for, you know, don't exist. So the cost of gas is often way cheaper, sometimes like negligible. The speed of, you know, blocks being created or transactions being mined ultimately is way faster, and so on. But there's this kind of called a scalability trilemma, I think, where you're always kind of trading off something. And I think one is like true decentralization, one is like scalability, and then the other one I forget. My brain's still waking up a little bit here, not that it's that early, but you're trading off something often with the L2s. And in some cases, at least, that's like true decentralization. You know, really, you know, like maybe that's a fine way of saying it, truly, you know, deeper decentralization, perhaps, I don't know. So what we then have also is this means of perhaps rolling things up or back, or back and bidirectionally back to the L1 as well. So so again, as I'm saying, I'm probably not doing it justice, but in summary, it's a way of achieving greater scalability on top of Ethereum's mainnet or the L1. So we kind of started with that, but hopefully that helps. And then please help in differentiating the applicability and domains of Ganache and Truffle. Hopefully I've kind of done that, maybe with some of my subsequent answers. But just to say, kind of high level again, Truffle is really about the workflow of creating your contracts. And associated, we saw a handful of those commands and essentially steps you would go through with which to do that. It was pretty high level, pretty fast. So fully understand if you're newish to the space, it may not have fully clicked yet. But Ganache complements that. It can be run standalone, and there's scenarios where you might use Ganache independently, for other things, and not need Truffle in this case, in that particular case. But what Ganache is a simulated chain, and as we saw, there's different flavors of that. We have a UI version, a CLI version, and then we have an EVM based or Ethereum based one. We have Filecoin now, and so on. So serving a different purpose, sometimes complementary or often complementary to Truffle. But hopefully that helps kind of unpack it again. Then scholarships or discount for consensus courses, definitely reach out either to me and or other consensus folks. Denver mentioned at the start as well, or at least to me before we kicked it off, that there's, and again, you might have had this debriefed already, but there's like this booth concept, like a metaverse and so on. So you can probably find other consensus folks there, but by all means reach out to me. Go ahead.
Metaverse is yet to be revealed, Kevin.
Oh dear, sorry. Well, just a little teaser. Yeah.
Little teaser, yeah.
To get you more excited if you're not already really excited. Sorry about that, Deborah. I hope I didn't give too much away there. But but yeah, reach out to anyone from consensus, and we'll connect. We can connect you to the right person around scholarships, discounts, etc. And then another question, Norul, I've got the pronunciation right. What if you deploy a Dapp, then you want to make an update to it? How would one go about it? So one example of that is you can create contracts that are upgradable. There's good patterns and approaches with which to do that. I did allude to one earlier in the sense of Open Zeppelin upgrades. So if you Googled that, they have both code, so things you would, run to do that, like the process with which you would go, do that, this upgrade scripts, but also what you would do to your contracts to make them upgradable as well, because you essentially creating a new instance of a contract, and the sort of state or data that's stored within it essentially kind of needs to be mapped over and so on. So absolutely, it's possible, and I would just start with Open Zeppelin upgrades as a starting point. There's variations of that, of course, and then does the Truffle contract allow us to sign transaction using accounts stored out of the Ethereum node? Yes, I think so. I mean, you can sign a transaction just completely independently, off the back of a key, like whether it's Web3 or Ethers or something even lower level. So I think that answers the question. The reference to kind of Truffle contract there, I'm not sure, how, but reach out for sure. And if you want to kind of dive into that, happy to kind of explore that out a little more, to perhaps see what you're actually trying to kind of solve for there. And then security, speed, yeah, okay, thank you. So I think that was my reference to that kind of that trilemma, that scalability trilemma: speed, decentralization, security. And then, so the consensus mechanisms work over L2. Yes, it's different to that of proof of work that mainnet Ethereum L1 currently leverages or utilizes. So there's different means of achieving consensus and so on L2s, depending on the L2. And again, lots of incredible thought and work gone into kind of ensuring that's reliable and robust and so on. But yes, is the easy answer to that one. And then gosh, metaverse. I never said that. I don't know. Just kidding. I did say it, but that's, yeah. Coming soon. Watch this space. So how to train neural nets on blockchain to restrict bad NFTs on a Dapp? Wow, gosh, great question. I mean, you've got a good training set or data set with which you could attempt to do some form of training there and restrict bad NFTs. Happy to chat, if I can help on kind of brainstorming that a little bit. It sounds very interesting. Yeah, and I will. The last question I see in the chat at least is my request for my email address. So let me just throw that in there. So it's a case insensitive anyway. But another question that's come in: do we require any centralized database with IPFS to store NFTs? No, not to store an IPFS for sure. The nature of IPFS is it's decentralized, which is it takes some time to wrap one's head around it, I guess, in a sense. And the degree of reliability of that storage is going to be questionable. It doesn't. There is a misconception. It's worth putting that out there that you put some money in IPFS, it's going to be there forever. That's not the case. There's some additional steps you'll need to go through to ensure its durability for sure. But I kind of touched on those. So Filecoin would be one way to do that. A pinning service or running your maintaining your own IPFS node. Obviously, that requires some infrastructure with which to do that. But it's the opposite of centralized, decentralized storage. And because of that, it's not really possible, to my knowledge at least, which is rudimentary, to censor it, take it, etc. All the things that perhaps for centralized storage can fall foul of. So there's that. Cool. Yeah, thank you, Sandeep, as well. Thank you too. And then I'll just jump over to the Q&A, and some of these may have already come over. And again, Denver, if we need to wrap up, I'm good. Teed up. Equally, I'm happy to carry on. If we're good to just keep rolling.
Maybe answer some of the quick.
Sure. Yeah, cool. And then, just as a mention as well, I did throw my email address in there. So if I don't get to your question or if other questions come up, kind of post this session, just
we'll have the Discord as well, so maybe they can then.
Sure. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so I'll answer maybe a few more. I don't want to kind of keep going indefinitely because we're already way over, but I'm happy to keep cranking. Yeah, thanks for the feedback, guys, as well. So can I create a private blockchain network of multiple nodes geographically distributed using Ganache Ui CLI? Maybe is the answer to that. If you want to kind of more simulate a semi-real network, or a kind of private / consortium network, I would look at some alternatives to Ganache for that. Possibly Besu would be one option. It depends what you're trying to solve for. Again, like things like Core. There's other client software or nodes, or I say nodes, client software that's more designed to set up a private network, and or just Geth as well. You can configure it to be such that it runs in private mode. So yeah, Ganache, you might be able to simulate it. It's a great question. I can ask internally if you want to reach out to me. Because there's for some of the maintainers of Ganache, I can ask directly, and they might, but it'd be sort of possibly not. So I'm sort of hesitant, but yeah. So in which case would the debugger not have the transaction source? Let's say you're debugging something that it's just a transaction on mainnet. You just got the transaction hash, and the contract's not either been verified, or even if it has. And verification just means that once a contract's been deployed, you can then kind of verify it with Etherscan, in the sense that you'll upload the source code for it. You'll do the recompilation, check some of the some integrity of the hash, or something like that. I'm not 100% sure, it's on my head at least, but just to kind of verify that the corresponding source code matches that of the bytecode that got. I guess it matches the bytecode, actually, as I say that. So then you can be sure that the code associated with that contract address is valid. But unless, if it's not been verified, or even you're not going to have the source for it, or even if it has, you don't necessarily have the source locally, might be flattened, and so on. So that, I guess, if that was in reference to that fetch external, that's really useful because it helps you, seamlessly get it, and kind of immediately debug and start stepping through that transaction, for example. It's really, really neat. Okay, so I'll do 2 more, and then we'll kind of revert to async for any others. So can we use this in Android like Flutter or Cotil? And by this, I'm not sure what the context might have been, whether it's Truffle or so on. I guess not directly. I'm kind of trying to make some inferences about what you're asking here. I think perhaps if where you're going with this is signing transactions within an app, like a mobile app, an Android or otherwise, it's worth looking at Metamask support for like deep linking, because you can have it such that you can sign a transaction in Metamask mobile. So there's an Android version of Metamask and an iOS version of Metamask, and your app could, essentially send a transaction over to Metamask for signing, and then I think Metamask would still broadcast it to the network, but then you get the hash perhaps back over to your app and so on. So pretty, decent integration there. You could also explore the signing within your app directly, and again, I'm making some inferences there, or kind of interaction with your Dapp. The big caveat, of course, is just having access to, from a user standpoint, them getting either their mnemonic, if that's how they've generated the account they're using, or the public and private key, or the private key for a given account, into the app to sign it. It's a kind of huge security consideration, for a user to just paste in their private key or mnemonic into an app that I perhaps don't trust or partially trust. So with that, that's where you would perhaps lean into something like MetaMask mobile or another mobile wallet to sort of handle that, wherein that's designed to securely store, the accounts. But again, reach out, happy to chat on all these things. And then finally, because I'll wrap it up here, but we can revert to async from where I'll be on Discord and email. It does fetch external debug any smart contract on the main chain. Yes, there's 2 caveats. One, it needs to be verified, as I was alluding to, and the other one is you need access to an archive node, and we can take that offline in terms of how you would do that as well. But yes, you can get any smart contract. Most of the major ones you're likely to be interacting with have been verified, I would say. So then you can debug them, which is really nice, really cool, both from a learning standpoint and troubleshooting and so on. Cool. So I think there was more questions, but yeah, just in the interest of time, we'll revert to either by all means reach out to me directly on email, and then as Denver mentioned, there's this. I'll make sure I'm on Discord as well to assist as best I can throughout the hackathon. So yeah, with that, thank you so much for having me, and best of luck, everyone. I can't wait to see what people produce. As I said at the start, I love hackathons, so I'm pumped always to be involved however I can. So yeah. Cool.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. Really glad having you here, and I think initially you planned to stay here for 45 minutes, but then so thanks for
my pleasure. Yeah.
Really
thank you for having me. And no, likewise. Always love to be involved in the things, awesome things like this. So but yeah, final thing, reach out, anyone reach out, and I'll be lurking on Discord to answer questions wherever I can as well. So yeah.
And since this is like a beginner level workshop and we want everyone to learn as much as possible, we'll try our best to get the recording across at the earliest to everybody who signed up for this hackathon. Even otherwise, do keep a lookout on the Devfolio YouTube, and I think Kevin can provide the slides as well.
We can find a way. I'll share them with you, Denver, and you can share them with the folks for sure. Yeah.
And yeah, stay tuned. Tomorrow is the hackathon kickoff, and there's something interesting coming up. The ETHOdyssey metaverse is waiting for you. Yeah, do join in tomorrow at 7:30.
Cool. And good luck, everyone.
Yeah. All right, folks. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks, Denver.